Happy October, everyone, and welcome to the first 15 Phenomenal Facts video of the Halloween season. This week, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most influential horror films of all time, Nosferatu. This creepy classic, directed by F.W. Murnau, was released in 1922 and is still chilling audiences today. Casual fans of scary movies may have heard of this film, but hardcore horror fans know it is one of the most important films of the genre. Today we'll be looking at some of the most interesting facts about this illustrious film that maybe even some of the most hardcore vampire fans don't know. Without further ado, here are 15 phenomenal facts about Nosferatu. Number 15. Nosferatu means absolutely nothing, or rather, we don't know what it means. The common misconception is that Nosferatu means vampire. In reality, though, it actually doesn't have a meaning. Our best guess is that it's a corruption of the Greek word Nosphoros, which means plague carrier. When you look deeper into what shaped Nosferatu, such as the setting and the look of the monster, this makes a whole lot of sense. Number 14. Why does Dracula look the way he does? We've seen many different interpretations of Dracula throughout film history. We've seen the suave and sexual Bela Lugosi, the size and power of Christopher Lee, and of course, Gary Oldman's ridiculous-looking beehive. But nonetheless, Nosferatu has a unique look for their vampire that is heavily influenced by the vampires of European folklore, rather than the Stoker novel. This vampire is a representation of death, pestilence, and has the appearance of a rat. His fangs, rather than being the long canines that we're used to seeing, protrude from the very front of his mouth. Rats were known to bring plague, and similar to the name, look, and plot of the film, the plague is a very important element to the Nosferatu story. Number 13. The Spanish influenza and Bremen plague of 1838. With every vampire story, the time period in which it was made influences how it's told. Nosferatu was filmed only a few years after the First World War, which led to 8 million deaths and 7 million permanently injured. However, much more devastating than the war itself was the Spanish influenza, which followed immediately after. Killing an estimated 50 to 100 million people, this plague heavily influenced the Nosferatu story because plague was what people were afraid of during this time period. In Nosferatu, Dracula spreads a plague throughout Bremen, which mirrors an actual plague that took place there in 1838, the same year the movie takes place. This obviously made Nosferatu even scarier to the people who were watching the film at that time. Rats bring plague, Dracula looks like a rat. Plain and simple. Number 12. Dracula has a cameo? This is a quick little moment that a lot of hardcore fans may not have noticed. In fact, this is something I'm just now learning myself when I was researching about this. Towards the beginning of the film, the actor who plays the Count can be seen working at a desk and looking up briefly when Renfield calls for Jonathan. Of course, since it's such a quick moment and he isn't recognizable at all, this moment is one that slips right under people's noses. Speaking of that actor who plays Dracula... Number 11. Appropriately spooky actor. Very little is known about the life and career of Max Shreck. No, not that Shreck. Even though he was the star of over 40 features, he's pretty much only known for this one. Part of the reason he was even cast in this film was because Murnau found him strikingly ugly, thus making makeup very minimal. In fact, only false teeth and ears were used to create this iconic character. Fittingly enough, Shreck is the German word for terror, and yes, it was his real last name. His performance in this film was so effective that many people believed he was actually a vampire in real life. Number 10. Shadow of the Vampire. Playing on this notion of Max Shreck actually being a vampire, Shadow of the Vampire is a fictionalized look at the making of Nosferatu, where F.W. Murnau does in fact hire a real vampire to play the part. It's a great dark comedy with phenomenal performances from Willem Dafoe as the vampire and John Malkovich as the director. Although it's a work of fiction, Nosferatu was made so long ago that who knows what actually happened on set. For all we know, it could have been true. Number 9. It's the oldest surviving Dracula film. Released nearly 100 years ago, Nosferatu is the first on-screen adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. However, there were a few films before it that featured the Dracula name. However, these films are lost and there is very little information known about them. 1 year before Nosferatu hit the big screen, there was a Hungarian film entitled Dracula's Death, or The Death of Dracula, depending on the translation. All that remains of this film is this grainy still, and from what we know, it didn't have much relation to the Bram Stoker novel. Some sources claim the film centered around an insane musician who believes he is Dracula, or that it centers around a girl in a mental institution who has recurring nightmares about Dracula. This is the only film known to actually exist. The Vampire Encyclopedia does claim that there is a Russian adaptation of the Bram Stoker novel from 1920. However, no images or any other information has been found, and I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere else other than this book, so this might not actually be real. Maybe in the future one of these films may rise from its earthbox, but until now, Nosferatu is the oldest surviving film to feature Dracula. Number 8. There are many different musical scores. If you've seen Nosferatu, you've probably noticed that in some parts the music doesn't necessarily match with what's going on in the picture tone-wise. This is because with nearly every release of the film, there's been a different soundtrack. The original score was played by an orchestra when it premiered in Berlin, but no recordings of the original music are known to exist. Home video releases of the film feature soundtracks that range anywhere from classical to electronic to jazz, because when I think Dracula, I think jazz. Number 7. Shooting day for night. Nosferatu was made in a time where filmmaking was still very new. As such, there really was no way for the filmmakers to shoot after dark because you wouldn't be able to see anything. So instead, they had to shoot all the night scenes during the day. If you're watching a black and white version of the film, chances are you may not even notice that a scene is supposed to be at night. For example, there's a pretty hilarious scene where it appears as if Dracula's carrying a coffin in the middle of the street in broad daylight. In most releases, however, these scenes have been tinted blue to match what the filmmakers were going for, and hopefully prevent a few chuckles from the crowd in the process. Even though Dracula carrying a coffin like that is hilarious regardless. Number 6. You don't see Nosferatu that much. Have you ever watched a horror movie and were just begging to see the monster? You wait around and you wait around with the human characters, just praying you'll actually see what you bought the ticket for? Well, Nosferatu is probably one of the first films to create this frustrating cliche. With a runtime of 81 minutes, Nosferatu only appears on screen for less than 9 of them. That means our title character is only featured for about 10% of the overall film. Although Nosferatu isn't seen very much, the mood and atmosphere still provide the audience with chills. Number 5. It was a key player in the film movement known as German Expressionism. German Expressionism was one of the greatest achievements in early cinema history. Like many other elements in Nosferatu, the style was heavily influenced by what was going on at the time. Without going into a huge history lesson about Germany post-World War I, Expressionism came to rise because the people of Germany were hurt emotionally, economically, and there was very little to be happy about after losing the war. The Expressionist movement reflected the mood of the people. The filmmakers began to build sets that were an embodiment of the inner turmoil of their characters, as well as the real people going through hardships. This led to intense shadows and warped architecture combining to create a hypnotizing, dreamlike atmosphere. Some other notable films to pioneer the German Expressionist movement are The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Golem, and Metropolis, which is often credited as the last in the genre due to both financial and social changes in Germany. Although there isn't too much Expressionism in film nowadays, its influence can still be seen every now and then, most notably in the work of Tim Burton. Number 4. It was highly illegal. Unable to get the rights from Bram Stoker's widow, the filmmakers made quite a bit of changes to the story to hopefully avoid lawsuits. The setting was changed from Victorian London to 17th century Germany, the key players' names were changed and some characters were combined or omitted altogether, and the ending is completely different, but we'll get to that. However, Florence Stoker immediately took legal action after she allegedly received an anonymous package of one of the film's promotional posters. She joined the British Incorporated Society of Authors and originally planned to sue the production company for copyright infringement. However, by this point the studio was bankrupt due to a whole string of terrible business decisions. Once it became clear to Miss Stoker that she would never make a penny off of Nosferatu, she did everything in her power to make sure the world would never see it again. Number 3. It was almost lost forever. In 1925, the court reached a settlement which included that all known copies of Murnau's film would be destroyed. Luckily for us, however, Nosferatu proved to be even more difficult to kill than Dracula himself. Over the next several years, surviving copies began to turn up, and it's rumored that Miss Stoker would relentlessly track them down and incinerate them before her death in 1937. However, Nosferatu continued to live on and is today considered one of the best silent films ever made. Number 2. It still permeates today. Nearly 100 years since it first rose from its coffin, Nosferatu is still regarded as one of, if not the best Dracula film ever made, and its impact is still extremely prevalent. It is currently the second highest rated horror film of all time on Rotten Tomatoes, and up until 1972 was banned in Sweden for being too scary. It was remade in 1979 by Werner Herzog, and it is a fantastic film in its own right, and has gained its own cult following over the years. Nosferatu imagery is still seen all over the place, and even if you haven't seen the film, you were probably familiar with the iconic images of Dracula coming through the doorway and his shadow creeping up the stairs. It has a beer by Great Lakes Brewing Company named after it, and of course, Nosferatu himself appears in the best episode of SpongeBob ever made.
Nosferatu!
However, the most important aspect of Nosferatu is that it affected nearly every vampire story that followed it. Number 1. Death by sunlight. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Not once in Bram Stoker's novel, not once in European folklore, and not once ever in history was a vampire vanquished by sunlight until Nosferatu. In fact, in Bram Stoker's novel, there's a very famous part where Dracula makes his way throughout the town in broad daylight. Stoker implies that sunlight may slightly weaken a vampire's powers, but never implies that it would ever kill one. Nosferatu essentially rewrote vampire history in everyone's mind. Since then, nearly every vampire story depicts sunlight as being fatal. Obviously, there are a few exceptions, but it's safe to say that the notion that a vampire can be killed by sunlight is the most common way to dispose of the creature. I guess in this regard, it is the most important vampire movie ever made. If it wasn't for Nosferatu, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today. I hope you guys enjoyed my 15 phenomenal facts about Nosferatu. If I missed out one of your favorites, leave it below in the comments. Also, if you guys want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe to my channel. If you haven't listened to this week's episode of my podcast yet, make sure you click right over here to check that out. Also, if you're watching this after October 6th, click right here to see the very first episode of our show, Lost on VHS. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.